Hello, Year 10. Um, obviously, writing exam answers to poetry is something that we would have gone through together and we would have worked out how to do. So I'm going to do a kind of small version of this for you. I'm not going to get you to write any poetry essays this week, so don't panic about that. What we're really going to use it for is a kind of introduction to how we would answer a poetry question, but it's also an opportunity for you to kind of revise the poems that we have looked at. So what I would say is that you can do this lesson more than once. So you can go through it once with one poem, well you'll see what I mean. You can go through it again with another. That might be something that I would recommend doing. Anyway, let's get started. Now, obviously, there's no pressure with regards to this, so don't feel like you have to do this more than once. Don't feel like you have to. This is just hopefully a useful tool in terms of starting looking at exam questions. Anyway, so in the exam, you have to write about 2 poems. You will have to write about 2 poems. That's in terms of the just the cluster that we look at in terms of power and conflict. There will be another 2 poems that you write about that you haven't seen. That's unseen poetry. We haven't started doing that yet. Don't worry about that. I'm talking about 2 poems from Power and Conflict. So when I say you have to write about 2 poems, you will have to write about more, but we're just talking about 2 of the poems that we will study before you go into the exam. So one of the poems will be chosen for you. So you go into the exam, you open it up, you turn to the poetry section, and the question will have already chosen one of the poems for you. You'll get a blank copy of that in the exam booklet, so you can annotate that. You won't have to panic about remembering lines from that because you'll have it there. The other poem that you'll have to write about in the same question, you can choose, but you don't have a copy of that. You don't have a copy of that. That poem is up to you. What you think the best other poem is to put next to that one. So, if, for example, this was the question, how does the poet explore the pointlessness of war, sometimes known as futility, the pointlessness of war, the futility of war in War Photographer and one other poem? So that's the kind of question you would get, and then you'd get a copy of War Photographer there, and it would say how does the poet explore the pointlessness of war in War Photographer and one other poem. So I would start by breaking this question down into sections. So how, that word how is appearing there, and we've got pointlessness of war. That's what's being discussed. That's the big thing. How is the question, is the sort of the sort of thing we're looking at what's happening. But pointlessness of war is the sort of content, and then War Photographer and one other poem. That's the poem we've got to work with. So starting with how, we're looking for poetic techniques here. It's more than just that. Obviously, it's more than just poetic techniques, but that's our kind of starting point if you're stuck. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's sort of it's thematic, it's ideas, it's thoughts, it's all that kind of thing. But it hinges on finding poetic techniques. Now, the pointlessness of war. So this is anywhere where war means nothing or achieves nothing. So we don't have to be entirely prescriptive. It might be that you find a poem that isn't actually explicitly about one war or war in general. I mean, if you think about War Photographer, that's actually about a photographer. It's not necessarily about war itself. So we're going to have to be a little bit abstract in our thinking already. And then finally, you choose this poem yourself. So you've got to think, when you read this question through, I'm looking for a poem that has something that I can write about in relation to the pointlessness of war. It might be that the poem says that war is a brilliant thing. You might want to have a kind of contrast there. It might be that it's something that is explicitly about the pointlessness of war. It might be about something that is implicitly about the pointlessness of war. Anyway, how do you choose your poem? How do you go about choosing your poem? How do you do this? So here's what you do. The first thing you're looking for is something that you feel confident writing about. That's the most important thing. That is, in my opinion, the most important thing that you have to consider when you're choosing your poem. You feel confident writing about it. The second thing is that you know that it fits the theme. That's the second most important thing, is that you know that it fits the theme. So you have to feel confident writing about it, but you also have to be able to link it back to the question. And the third thing is that you can remember some quotes from it. Now, obviously, the title, we've talked about this before, the title is a quote. The title is something for you to write about, and you can write about the context without remembering quotes specifically, but you will need to remember something from it. So this is where, just like for Jekyll and Hyde, and just like for Inspector Calls, remembering some quotes is incredibly important, and learning those quotes and knowing them off by heart. But I think probably you already do know some. You might not necessarily know that you know some already, but I think that you probably do, based on the amount of time that we've spent looking at particular poems and the exposure that you've had to them. Oh, exposure. Okay. Anyway, so I've chosen Charge of the Light Brigade as my other poem for this. So that's what I've chosen. Imagine that I'm sitting there in my exam. I've gone through this thought process, and I've gone, right, I feel confident writing about it. I know it fits the theme, and I can remember some quotes from it. I've gone for the Charge of the Light Brigade. And these are the reasons why. So, firstly, because it's a mixture of angry and patriotic. So if we think about what I was saying before about how in the question, when it says the pointlessness of war, you might have something that contrasts. You might have something that says war does have a bit of a point. There is an element of patriotism to it. There's all that stuff about how brave they are and how noble they are and honouring the charge they made. So I think that's quite interesting, because it's a poem that sort of suggests that war is stupid, but also that there is something good about it. It's a very different style of poem from War Photographer. It's from a very different time in history. It's the poet themselves is very different to the poet that wrote War Photographer, and I also think that its structure is very different. The pattern of the stanzas is very different. There's a lot structurally to compare there, so I might choose it because of that. And thirdly, because it's almost a form of journalism. Now I think this is quite interesting, because War Photographer is about someone who is a photojournalist, someone who is chronicling things. The poem is about a journalist in a sense, and it's also a form of journalism. The poem is also a form of journalism about a journalist, War Photographer, because it's about a real poet. It's based on Don McCullum. So Charge of the Light Brigade is almost the same thing. It's a writer sharing the sort of the reality of a military event with the people back home. We're talking about a time where there wasn't necessarily there wasn't the immediacy of communication that we have today. There wasn't that way of relaying that information back so quickly. So this poem was written swiftly by Tennyson, and it was shared almost as a kind of accurate account of the events. And it's certainly one of the most famous surviving accounts of the Charge of the Light Brigade. So I thought that was quite an interesting point. So now that we've chosen our poem, hopefully you'll begin to have chosen your poem yourself. You'll be thinking about it, but don't worry if you haven't. That's fine. You can just carry on watching. No need to pause and decide now. I'm just saying that those were my reasons for Charge of the Light Brigade. You might think of some reasons. You don't immediately need to think about writing the essay, so don't panic about that now. We're just going through the process of choosing the poem, and now we're going to look at the question again. So we broke it down before into those three kind of parts, and we need to now start thinking about where the pointlessness of war appears in those poems. Here's the key thing, though. This question: how does the poet explore? That word explore, the pointlessness of war. It's about poets exploring a theme. There's not going to be a correct answer. There's not going to be a definitive answer. So if you're looking at that question going, oh, I don't know, I've got some ideas, but I don't have an answer, don't worry, there isn't one. It's all about you making an argument. In a sense, you're exploring this yourself. It says, how does the poet explore? It's almost like it should say, you will now explore how the poet explores the pointlessness of war. All of this is about conjecture and ideas and argument and opinion. That's the key thing. It goes back to everything else that we've looked at. It's you coming up with your own idea. I am not going to tell you that something is wrong, and I'm not going to tell you there's an absolutely correct answer. I might do this question, I might do this video in 2 weeks' time and have completely different ideas. And that's perfectly okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's all about how you structure that response. Anyway, So this is an intimidating page. We'll go through it step by step. The reason that it's all come up in one go is because I couldn't work out how to get the animations for each box to appear one by one. So we'll talk it through. So what I would begin by doing is I would make a table, and I could do it as a spider diagram. You know how much I love a spider diagram. And I could do it as bullet points. There's lots of different ways you can do it. I've chosen to do it as a table for a particular reason that you will see in due course. So I would say 3 ways the theme is explored in each poem, and I'd stick a quote in there as well. So really, it's kind of 3 ideas per poem about the pointlessness of war. And it's the exploration of the pointlessness of war, so it doesn't need to be absolutely 100% precise at the moment. So, starting with War Photographer on the left-hand side, first one there, the reaction of the Sunday supplement reader. So I think that reflects the pointlessness of war. They do not care is a reference to them, possibly. We don't know who the they are. It could be society, it could be people in general, but, you know, the Sunday supplement reader, their eyes prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. But there's no suggestion they do anything beyond that. They don't do very much. The pointlessness of war here, rather than the pointlessness of photojournalism, is suggesting that the war has had absolutely no impact on their life. So the war isn't changing the world, but also that the sort of the reflection of war isn't changing them. That war is sort of meaningless in this society. Moving down, the photographer feels that their job makes no difference. So remember we have that thing with Don McCullum where he goes, you know, the war thing, I'm not proud of it. That fantastic quote, you know, it's what he's famous for. He goes, I'm not even proud of it. You know, I've got awards in my shed. He stares impassively. So the war has made no difference to him. He makes no difference with it. Nothing happens as a result of it. People die, but that's it. You know, he stares impassively. He's sort of seen so much of it, it doesn't bother him anymore. And he also feels that nothing happens. Moving on to the third point there about war photographer. So this simile of priest. Now, I'm not suggesting that all priests are ignored when I say this, but what I am suggesting is that priests and religions in general have been around, the majority of them, for a very, very long time. And they all, without a doubt, every single one of them, has nothing in there apart from foolish misinterpretation about war. There's nothing in any religion that says you should go and kill people. They all say, of course you shouldn't kill people, don't be ridiculous. So this idea that, you know, if people listen to religion, there would be no wars, is obviously, you know, sort of like it's that idea of the misinterpretation of them. So this idea that he is like a priest sort of suggests already he's preparing to intone a mass, and that's great and that's wonderful, and people and you know and there will be people that are going to listen to him, and there will be people that do listen to his mass, as it were, and do look at his photographs and are moved by them. But ultimately, it doesn't make a wider difference, and that also suggests that war itself doesn't make a difference. You know, I think really my big argument would be, if I was writing this essay, is that war photographer shows the pointlessness of war through the fact that it doesn't affect anyone. You know, no one is moved by it beyond the person who experiences it, so it's basically pointless. Anyway, moving on to the right-hand side, the Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, it's a slightly different poem, so no one could understand why they were doing something so stupid. So it is stupid, it's pointless. Why did those people die? All the world wondered. It's not about war in general, that quote, but I think that you could say that it's possibly a wider point. You know, is Tennyson, you have to think about the context. You have to think about the fact that Tennyson is the poet laureate. You've got to think about the fact that he is writing in the 1850s at a time where questioning the establishment and the political establishment and the military establishment would not get your poems published. So he's subtly questioning the point of this war here. He is questioning the point of war in general through the microcosm of this particular military action. My second point there on the right-hand side, the poet does express some positivity to bravery for bravery's sake. So this is quite interesting because this actually is sort of expressing that there might be a point of war. You know, he's saying it's okay. You know, bravery for bravery's sake is something that we should honour. We should be pleased with. You know, honour the charge they made, not feel disgusted by the charge they made. Honour it. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. This idea of bravery being celebrated. And my final point there, the poet questions the strangeness of following orders that make no sense in an expression that may be a metaphor for the pointlessness of war in general. That's a long sentence I've written there, but basically what I'm saying is here that not though the soldier knew, that should be, sorry, I've typed that wrong, someone had blundered. So there's this bit where he's sort of saying everyone knew it was a mistake and they still did it. Why are they following those orders? And that, again, I think is a sort of wider metaphor. You know, he's not saying that war is stupid explicitly, though I think he might be saying it implicitly. You know, I think it's almost sort of prophetic. It's almost predicting the First World War and trench warfare and the kind of the why are we doing this? You know, another link that you could kind of make if we were looking at another poem here in terms of the pointlessness would be in Exposure, when they say what are we doing here? Why are we here? You know, all that kind of like what is the point of what is happening? So that's what I would do. Now, the next thing you do with this, once you've kind of got 3 ideas from each poem roughly, is find some points of comparison. So how do I compare these ideas? What are they? Now, I have very carefully put them next to each other. Now, this is just a suggestion of the way that you could find those points of comparison. So when we were planning our Inspector Calls essays back in the classroom, all the way back in the autumn term, we kind of looked for sort of headlines, sort of big things. You know, is it about society? Is it about gender? And I would say try and find points that correlate under a big kind of headline. So I have very helpfully put them all next to each other, I would compare. But it might be that when you write your list of 3, excuse me, it might be that when you write your list of 3 that your arrows are kind of going all over the place, linking them up. And it might be that they're quite difficult to link. It might be that you have to change them slightly, but once you've done this, you've got a really strong structure for how you would come up with an answer. And I've just got some headlines down for each point. So the first one for this comparison here is public. So the wider public. So they do not care, I would compare to All the World Wondered. Those are 2 very different reactions to war, but both of them suggest that war is pointless. One suggesting war is pointless because they have no response. One suggesting war is pointless because they were all thinking, why the hell are you doing that? So, 2 very different reactions, both questioning the point of war. Second one here, reporting. So both of these are kind of linked to the idea of sharing information about the war and kind of what they suggest they would do. So Don McCullum feels that his job makes no difference, you know, so stares impassively. Duffy there kind of writes she writes of this poet who could take it or leave it. It doesn't matter that the pictures get published because no one's gonna listen anyway. Whereas Tennyson, it's an imperative, it's a command to the reader. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade. It's bold, it's dominant, it's imperative, it's telling us what to do. So Don McCullum goes, whatever, fine, you know, and it's not even him who chooses the photographs, it's the editor who chooses the photographs. But there's a kind of real difference there in how they value what they're sharing about the war. And I think Tennyson feels that war there, in that moment, is that idea of bravery for bravery's sake is something that's worth celebrating, and Don McCullum feels like it makes no difference. So that's my kind of second idea, is reporting. And so my third idea here, this phrase I really like to use, so inevitability, so where something's definitely going to happen, there's no way you can stop something happening. Inexorable means inescapable. It's a fantastic word. I always like to use it when we talk about war poetry, because I like this idea is sort of that link that we've started to make between war and nature, particularly human nature, this idea of it being inescapable. War is inexorable. War is unescapable. So there's a simile in War Photographer of this idea of the priest, and we talked about that and kind of the priest of always being there, but there is this thing of religion is ever present, war is ever present, they're things that we can't escape, they're things that are always part of our society. And then the charge of the Light Brigade, the poet questioning this kind of, you know, sort of, everyone knew it was stupid, but we still did it. I mean, how many wars have we fought? I mean, there's fighting still going on, you know, and you think the whole world has stopped for this global crisis, and yet there's still fighting going on. It's unbelievable, you know, and it's been going on for literally thousands of years. we can't stop having wars. We can't stop fighting. We can't stop it. There's no escape, even though we all know that it is unbelievably stupid. And again, I would link this idea to the idea of the priest, and I think there's a metaphor for imperialism there, and sort of religions going abroad, spreading their word, creating their own little empires. You think about Christianity in Africa. I think there's something about the British Empire wanting to get involved in the Crimean War. I mean, obviously the British Empire was not the instigator of that war, obviously, as I explained in the video. But I still think there's something interesting there. There's an interesting parallel. Anyway, so find those points of comparison and come up with little headlines for them. So here's what I want you to do now. I want you to take 40 minutes. If it takes a bit longer, that's okay. Don't panic. I want you to make a table like I did, and then draw in those arrows of comparison and put the little headlines on. So that's what it looks like. You can obviously pause the video on this page if that's helpful. I honestly would encourage you to think about choosing a poem that you're more comfortable. Don't just pick the same one as me because Mr. Randall's chosen it. I haven't chosen this poem because I think it's the best one. I've chosen it because if I was in the exam, it's the one I would choose, but that doesn't make it right. I'm a different person to you. So, to be honest with you, I think there's more on the pointlessness of war in exposure, but it's also, Remains is full of it as well. So there's lots of options there. Anyway, so I want you to make a table like I did and draw the arrows of comparison. Now, when I say make a table, if you'd rather make bullet points, of course that is fine. You're not handing this bit in. You can make it however you like. I just want to know that you've come up with ideas for each poem and you've worked out how you would compare them. So that's what you're going to do now for 40 minutes. So you can pause the video and do that in a second, because I'm just going to go through the final thing that you'll do after that. So after you've done that, then I want you to go back to Google Classroom and fill in the worksheet that relates to this lesson. So after you've done that, after you've done that 40-minute task of coming up with your own table and your own points of comparison, then go back to the classroom, and I've made a Google form for you to fill out, just so I can see what you've done and I know what ideas you're coming up with. Obviously, you can watch this video as many times as you like. That's what it's there for. And if you've got any questions, message me on Google Classroom. So I will just go back and remind you, this is what you're doing now for 40 minutes. Obviously, you don't have to do it now. You can come back to this later. It's entirely up to you how you want to structure your time. But this is the next task to do after watching the video, and then it's back to Google Classroom and filling in the worksheet. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense, and I look forward to hearing from you about how useful this was. Okay, fantastic.